Please summarize your seminar and highlight your main argument.
So my seminar is about nuclear compellence, and it's based on a paper that I've written with my former GW colleague, Charlie Glazer, called Compelling with the Bomb, Revisiting the Effectiveness of Nuclear Compellant Threats. And the basic question we're asking is, can states threaten other states with nuclear weapons to get them to make a change in their policy? Not to deter them from attack. We're not talking about deterrence, we're talking about compellence. Can you get a state to change its behavior? And we cut into this because we think the existing literature is sort of off base. On the one hand, there are people who are quite optimistic that having nuclear superiority allows states to get their way in threat making. And then there's a very pessimistic school of thought which holds that nuclear weapons aren't much good for compellence at all. And we kind of come in between. Ours is a sort of conditional argument. Under what conditions might nuclear threats be effective? And our argument is essentially that there's really not that many cases of nuclear compellence. A lot of the literature these days uses large N data sets, and it makes it look like there's a lot of cases. But really, when making a nuclear threat, so having a compellant demand plus threatening to use nuclear weapons, either implicitly or explicitly, there's only 6, 7, 8, 9, less than 10 cases since World War II. And so first of all, we need to look at those. And then second of all, we need to take into account the nature of crises. And crises are not sort of bolts from the blue. So nuclear threats don't usually just come out of nowhere. They're the product of a crisis that escalates. And the longer that states stay in a crisis, the more resolved they are, because they're not dropping out as the crisis escalates. By the time a nuclear threat is made, it tends to involve states that are pretty highly committed. And therefore, you can't really look at variables from before the crisis to tell you sort of what the outcome will be. It's going to come down to who does what in the crisis itself. Who can the compeller credibly signal that they would use a nuclear weapon to persuade the other side to back down?
In your read ahead, you argue that both nuclear coercionists and nuclear skeptics draw unwarranted conclusions due to neglecting strategic selection in their theories. Can you explain the two types of nuclear compellant threats and the importance of strategic selection in determining the usefulness of threats in achieving compellence?
Exactly. So we think that the literature on this has neglected selection processes. So this is well known in deterrence. But the current literature on nuclear compellence has not sort of incorporated this. And it's what I was mentioning before, which is that crises unfold sort of in a step-by-step process. So it could start as a conventional threat by one side. If the other side resists, the first side might launch a conventional attack. The other side might resist. The compeller might then escalate to a nuclear threat. And by that time, the two sides are probably both highly resolved. And so, again, it's hard to predict based on variables from before the crisis, like did we have a lot of nuclear weapons, or what was our conventional capability like, or how strong were our interests. It's what you demonstrate then in the crisis with signaling. And again, can I make a nuclear threat credible enough to persuade you that I would actually do it and persuade you to back down? There's one exception to this argument, and we call it the surprise model. And that's when, so typically in a selection argument, the idea is that you look at all of the other states' capabilities. You're looking at their capabilities and their interests. So you would say, oh, they have this many armored divisions, that many nuclear weapons, and so forth. But in a lot of occasions, targets don't perceive a crisis as nuclear, right? They just don't think nuclear weapons matter for whatever the crisis is about, or they don't actually know that the compeller has nuclear weapons. That happened in the case of the United States and Japan in 1945. And in that case, if the compeller makes a nuclear threat all of a sudden, it's a huge surprise to the target who thought they were not in a crisis like that. And they can't then select out, right? There's no chance. So the thing that matters then is the nuclear threat itself. And so we have the selection model where there's escalation step by step producing highly resolved states, and therefore it's hard. It's going to be a toss-up, depending on how the signaling plays out in the crisis, or the surprise logic, where the target is not expecting a nuclear threat or anticipating a crisis as being nuclear, and then is taken by surprise by the threat.
Your paper discusses the policy implications of the effectiveness of nuclear compellence. Can you explain a bit more the differences in policy thinking between nuclear weapons from a deterrence lens and from a compellence lens, particularly with regards to counterproliferation?
Sure. For a long time, the literature on nuclear weapons focused on deterrence. So shortly after World War II, when the nuclear weapons were first unveiled in 1945, theorists started thinking about their effects. And they can be great for deterrence because they raise the cost of war to such an astronomical level. And if two sides have nuclear arsenals that are too big to sort of destroy in a first strike, that can lead to a stable situation called mutual assured destruction. And that's sort of what a lot of people argue prevailed during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So nuclear weapons had a deterrent function. And if you think states are motivated by security, they're worried about a security threat, they acquire nuclear weapons for sort of defensive purposes, right, to deter aggression against them, then you would, maybe not be happy about nuclear proliferation, but it's less worrisome than if a state is acquiring nuclear weapons to compel adversaries. So this is a worry about contemporary proliferators now. A lot of people argue that Iran, if it acquires nuclear weapons, will become more aggressive. And there's some evidence of this in the Pakistan case, that after Pakistan made its nuclear arsenals public in 1998, that it started acting more aggressively vis-a-vis India because it knew it could sort of hold off the Indians' retaliation by threatening a nuclear strike. And so the Indians would moderate what they were doing. So compellence being inherently offensive, if the concern is that states are going to take their nuclear weapons, be able to make threats with them, and compel other states, push them around, take things from them, then it's obviously quite worrisome. The evidence on this is mixed. There's some evidence, like I mentioned with the Pakistan case, that this can enable aggression. Others argue that it changes over time, right? So early on, leaders don't have a lot of experience with nuclear weapons, and they might behave kind of recklessly. But once they get scared a few times in a crisis, they learn, right? And they tone it down, and things become more stable. And this argument is made about Nikita Khrushchev in particular, who early on made a lot of outlandish threats with nuclear weapons, tried to put nuclear weapons into Cuba, and really got frightened badly by what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and therefore sort of settled down more into a sort of stable equilibrium.
Your first book, Targeting Civilians in War, claims that desperation is one of the two main factors in increasing civilian targeting. Does desperation have a similar impact on a state's willingness to use nuclear weapons and thus increase the credibility and by extension success of nuclear compellent threats?
Yes, it can. It's an interesting parallel because in that book, the basic argument is that when states go to war, they don't set out to fight a long war of attrition, right? They have a plan to win a quick and decisive victory. And that's usually done by a military attack, blitzkrieg, what have you. It's only when the war goes wrong that they start reaching for other instruments to try to persuade the other side to give up. And one of those, unfortunately, is targeting the adversary's civilians. In the case of nuclear compellence, it's not the case that most of the time states that have the most nuclear weapons are going to win crises. It's really about interests at stake. And can the two sides signal their relative interests? And if you think about it, whose interests are going to be stronger? A side that's sort of on the offense or a side that's fighting for its life? And so some of the contemporary policy implications that we talk about consider Russia that's losing the war in Ukraine. It's being pushed back. And Vladimir Putin makes a nuclear compelling threat saying, stop the offensive, or NATO back off, or we'll use a nuclear weapon. He's desperate, right? He's in bad circumstances. His interests are very strong, either in political survival. Similarly, a China that gets in a war over Taiwan, and the United States intervenes and is losing. China is losing. And it makes a nuclear threat against the United States to say, hey, get out of the war, or we will use a nuclear weapon against you. I'm not saying that would necessarily succeed, but it would be quite credible because of the desperate circumstances and very, very strong interests, in other words, that the compeller would have.